Hi, everybody. This is Kylie Hillner with Centralized Training at the UT Health Science Center, San Antonio. We are happy you could join us for the second of the three trauma-focused CBT webinars that are being put on as part of the larger HHSC CMH webinar series. So Amelia Summers from HHSC and I are happy to welcome back Dr. Susana Rivera, who will be discussing TF-CBT and traumatic grief and separation. So before I hand it over to her, just a few reminders. Everyone is muted, so the only way to communicate is through the questions box on your control panel, which should be over to the right of your screen. We do ask that you communicate through there, put in any questions or comments that come up, and then we're going to have a couple minutes at the end of the webinar to address those questions. Don't forget, you can listen to the presentation either through your speakers on your computer or through your telephone via the number that was provided on the webinar invite. You'll want to pick one or the other just so you don't have like a feedback loop going on. As always, the slides for today's webinar are available under your handout section of the control panel. So they're there. I'm also going to be emailing out the slides and the recording of the webinar later this afternoon, so you'll have those to go back and review if you need to. So without any further ado, please welcome Dr. Rivera.
Thank you, and good morning, everybody. Thank you all so much for joining the second of three webinars. Today we are talking about TF-CBT and traumatic grief and separation. Before we started the webinar, before we went live, we had a few minutes to chat as we were testing the equipment and everything, and I was commenting that this probably sounds really odd to a non-therapist and really strange, but I actually really enjoy grief cases. So as a trauma therapist, of course, I've seen all types of trauma cases, but several years ago, for those of you who have not trained with me before and may not be familiar with who I am and where I come from, I am in Laredo, Texas. If you're not up on your Texas geography, I am right on the Texas-Mexico border. So a lot of the border issues, of course, have been affecting us. And I oversee a pretty large nonprofit. I oversee the trauma center. I oversee all victim services. And because I am a program administrator, I really don't get to do very much direct service in this role. So several years ago, I decided I really just need to get back to doing direct treatment. As much as I love my trauma center and I have such a strong team that I am incredibly proud of, I just need that break from administrative work. So I decided to open up a private practice and something that I just do part-time 3 evenings a week. And my very, very first referral, once I got the word out that I was starting this, was a grief case. And my goodness, talk about starting off with a bang. My very first referral was a 15-year-old girl who was from Mexico. She was from Nuevo Laredo, which is our sister city. And she had come to the States because she was in the process of being adopted by her mother's cousin. And the reason for that was that at the time when I opened my private practice, this is when the border violence was just at its worst here in Laredo. And her family, her mother, her father, and her only sibling, who was an older sister, had been asleep in their home. My client had woken up in the middle of the night to use the restroom when she heard noise downstairs. And she quickly hid, so she was spared, but her parents and her sibling were shot. And after they were shot, and we're talking execution style, after they were shot, she heard the footsteps going back downstairs, and the next thing that she knew, the house was on fire. So the house had been set on fire. She was able to get out. She was able to escape, and she watched. She checked in on her relatives. They were all dead. And so she's outside in the yard, and she is watching as her house burns down with her family still in there. And this was an act of cartel violence. We came to find out after the fact that it was actually a mistake. The cartel was trying to target the home next door, but they accidentally targeted my client's home instead. So after that, she came to Laredo. She came to the U.S. to live with her mother's cousin, who was in the process of adopting her. And it was just such a culture shock for her. She knew a little bit of English that she had learned from watching. She watched a lot of Disney Channel, and that's how she was learning English. So she's in a different country with relatives that she really didn't see very often, that she wasn't very close to. She had been enrolled in school here. She's trying to just really learn the language, trying to adjust to a new culture, grieving, obviously, for her parents and her sibling, and just really having a difficult time adjusting to this new family and their ways of living, and wanting to bond with them, but having trouble bonding with them because she felt as if she allowed herself to bond with them, it was disloyal to her family. To her, we came to call them her first family, and her adopted family was her new family. So that was my very, very first referral. And I remember getting the phone call and hearing the story and meeting her the following day and thinking, yes, this is why I do what I do, because of cases like this. And I actually worked with her for about a year. And then we took a break. And then when the adoption was finalized, I got to see her for a short period, again, just to go through that transition phase with her. Excuse me. And it was just so rewarding for me to see how far she had come. So I really, after that, it just really solidified for me how much I enjoy working grief and sexual abuse cases. So those are my, I guess, my two go-tos in my community. That's what I am most known for. So when I was asked to do these webinars and we were tossing around ideas for different topics, I immediately said that I wanted to do something on traumatic grief and separation. And the reason that we threw in the word separation is because for many, many years, the the definition, I guess, of traumatic grief was it had only to do with death. And we've since learned that grief is not just about death. We experience grief. Children experience grief when they experience any type of separation. So it doesn't have to be something permanent. It can be any type of separation that is going to occur for varying amounts of time. And so what we see here is we see separation because of divorce sometimes. And sometimes when it's a case of divorce, the other parent, the non-custodial parent, isn't always very consistent with visitation. So the child loses that family unit, and they may very well lose a parent. Of course, they also experience separation through incarceration. Right now, the big thing in the news, of course, I'm sure you all have heard, is issues with immigration and deportation. And I think it's not just for me living along the border, but these families, undocumented families, are just all over Texas, all over the U.S., and a lot of children just live with that fear of having their caregiver deported because they are here illegally. Of course, military deployments, that will also separate families for extended periods sometimes, and of course, termination of parental rights. So when we talk about grief, we want to just expand our thinking and think beyond just death. Although I do want to make a comment about death and uh, address the issue of death of a pet, because I realize that not everybody is an animal lover, but for those who are animal lovers and who have family pets, that pet is actually a member of the family. And so when a pet passes, for children, it's almost like losing a sibling. So we don't want to discount the grief that a child might experience from losing a family pet. So when we start talking about grief and we talk about separation, um, of course there is your typical grieving period, and I do want to stress that there's no right or wrong way to grieve. There's no timeline for grief either. We all experience grief in different ways, and I think this is probably one trauma that all of us can relate to. When we're working with trauma exposed youth, all of us at some point have lost somebody that we were close to, or will at some point lose somebody that we are very close to. So this is one that I think all of us can really relate to. It becomes an issue. It becomes traumatic grief when the response to the death or the response to the separation is so severe that it begins to interfere with the child's functioning. So it is possible for children to develop post-traumatic stress symptoms or PTSD because of that separation, because of that grief. And the clinical presentation, those clinical challenges are going to be very, very similar to PTSD due to any other type of trauma. The impact, if it's not a death case, if it is a separation case, there is the potential, of course, for reunification. So, in cases of military deployment, in cases of immigration and deportation, there is that possibility, that hope, of course, that there will be reunification when children are maybe removed from a home because of child welfare involvement, because of CPS involvement. Of course, this is something that I know that CPS caseworkers are always working towards, is reunification. But a lot of the impact, a lot of the trauma symptoms may persist even after reunification. And we won't go into each of these in great detail. I know that you all have the handouts, so this is something that you will be able to refer back to. But what we are seeing is a lot of minimizing the experiences that may have led to the separation. So, for example, in a child abuse case, when the child has had to be removed from the home, the child is likely most impacted by the separation, by CPS involvement, by having to be in foster care, by having to live with another relative. And that could be because this child, all they've ever known is abuse and neglect and trauma. So what was happening that led to the removal, that was their normal. That was all they knew. That was all they understood. But they may still minimize it or deny that it happened because they hope that this will lead to reunification. One of the I did mention in the beginning that I do work for a large nonprofit here in Laredo. We serve 19 surrounding counties, and we have about 30, close to 30 programs. And one of our programs is an emergency youth shelter, and this is for children who are runaways, who are homeless, or who have been removed from their home because of CPS involvement. And one of my trauma counselors is housed at our emergency youth shelter. And not too long ago, she was in my office, and I'm just checking in with her, asking how things are going, talking about some of her cases. And she told me about one little girl that she was working with. This little girl, she had probably been at the shelter for about 2 days, and this little girl asked her, "Will you play with me?" So, of course, my counselor, Naomi, says, "Of course, I'll play with you." So, this little girl gets a piece of paper and a pen, and this is a little girl, about 7 years old, I think. And she tells the counselor, she tells Naomi, "We're going to play CPS. I'm going to be the caseworker, and you're going to be the kid." And so the child starts asking questions and asks her, "Now, does your family drink?" "My mom doesn't drink." And then she asked, "Does your family fight?" "My family doesn't fight." And after all of these questions, she would very quickly jump in to say that her family doesn't do that. And then one of the questions that she asked was, "Do you love your mom? Because if you say you love your mom, then you can go home to your mom. But if you say you don't love your mom, then you can't ever see your mom again." So I thought, wow, that was just so powerful for me, because this is a little girl who's playing out her trauma of being separated. And this little girl has been in the system long enough to know that her responses to these questions are going to impact the outcome, whether she gets to see her mother again, whether she gets to go home. So, minimizing, denying the things that she has witnessed that led to the separation. So that was, I thought, the perfect example for that. And as I was putting these slides together, I just kept thinking of that little girl that Naomi worked with. So you will see some of that, but of course you'll also see negative beliefs about the absent, about the caregiver, and about the child themselves. So a lot of, if I had only behaved better, then they wouldn't have left. If only they had been more careful, then immigration wouldn't have picked them up. So it's all their fault. And something that I often mention during my trainings, when I'm doing trauma-focused trainings, is that the way that children develop is that they are always building on the skills that they learned in a previous developmental stage. So, for example, if you see a toddler and they're running, they didn't just start running. Before they could run, they had to learn how to walk. Before they could walk, they had to learn how to stand. So they had to learn how to pull themselves up. But before they could learn how to pull themselves up, they had to learn how to crawl. And before they could learn to crawl, they had to learn how to roll over. So every time that they learned a new skill, how to roll over, how to crawl, how to pull themselves up, that led to the development of new skills. But when you have a child who has been trauma exposed, then all of the energy that is supposed to go into learning a new task, so the energy that a toddler is putting into learning how to walk without holding onto furniture, all of that energy is instead going into just surviving the crisis, surviving what is going on in the moment. So it's not uncommon when we see a grief case, when we see a separation case, to see a disruption in development and also to see some regressive behaviors. Of course, a lot of distrust of others, of the system. And even though I believe everybody on the call right now is a therapist, even though our role is to help them to deal with their trauma reminders, to help them to cope with their trauma symptoms, they still see us as part of the system sometimes. So they can even be distrustful of us. We, of course, will see in separation cases disrupted attachment, and we don't want to just consider attachment with the primary caregiver, but also sibling attachment. Oftentimes when children are separated, they're not always placed in the same foster home. Some families are not able to take sibling groups. Even now with immigration and deportation, we're seeing cases where maybe the older siblings were undocumented, but the younger ones are U.S. born. So they are being separated also. So we will see disrupted attachment. And again, that can also continue. We don't want to assume that because they have been reunified, that everything just goes back to normal and the relationships pick up right where they left off. And of course, you're going to see a lot of the PTSD symptoms, the intrusive thoughts, the trauma reminders, the nightmares, the hypervigilance, the avoidance, and things that were previously typically innocuous can suddenly become significant trauma reminders for a child. And of course, we're going to see the behavioral dysregulation. We all know that even though we market ourselves as trauma therapists, and that is, what we do, children are not typically referred to us because of a trauma history. Children are often referred because of behavioral problems. So it's definitely going to be something that we can expect to see is that behavioral dysregulation, those behavioral problems. And of course, the reason that we're doing CBT or TF-CBT with these kids is because we're going to see a lot of distorted cognitions. I'm going back to those negative beliefs about the self and about the caregiver, just a lot of guilt, a lot of self-blame. It had to be something that I did or something that I didn't do, and this is why we are now being separated. I did mention in the previous slide that it's typical to see some disrupted attachment. And so there is a developmental impact, of course, of traumatic grief and traumatic separation. And on this slide, you see just a few bullet points that highlight some of the impact that we might see. Of course, confusion about what is happening and why, especially in younger children. Why were they separated? Did they do something wrong? So I mentioned that in abuse cases, for a lot of children, the trauma that they have lived with, the abuse and the neglect that they have lived with, this was normal to them. This is all they've ever known. So they don't understand why they were suddenly being taken away from their home. Likewise, a lot of children that we've seen here, they had no idea that their parents were undocumented. They had no idea that the family was here illegally, so they don't understand why all of a sudden somebody came into their home and took their parents. A lot of questions about not only what is happening, but when will they be reunified with their parents? When will they be reunified with siblings, with other loved ones? And I do want to mention a book that was actually written by another TF-CBT trainer. Her name is Jennifer Wilgocki, Wilgocki, and it's a book called Maybe Days. And I really like that. It was originally written for children involved in the child welfare system, children in foster care, children in in placement. But I can certainly see how appropriate and how relevant this book is with children experiencing any kind of separation. And the reason that it's called Maybe Days is because it seems that children who are outside of the home, who've been removed from the home, who are in placement, they have a lot of questions. And they are going to ask questions like, am I going to see my mom again? Am I going to see my brothers and sisters again? Am I going to get to go back home? Am I going to be moved to another foster home? Am I going to go to another shelter? And it seems like no matter what the question is, the answer always seems to be maybe. Because it is so difficult to give these children a straight answer. I don't know if they're going to be reunified. I don't know when they're going to be reunified. I don't know how long they're going to stay in this foster home. I don't know if they're going to have to go into another shelter. So I just wanted to make a quick plug for the book Maybe Days. I use that book quite often, and I think it goes a long ways towards normalizing for children what they're experiencing. A lot of anxiety also. That's part of the developmental impact. I did mention regressive behaviors in the previous slide, but also a lot of anxiety over separation. Excuse me. I did mention that we do see some traumatic separation in cases of immigration and deportation. And one of the things that I am seeing is that children are separated from their primary caregiver because their primary caregiver has been deported. So the child maybe is placed with another relative. But if this other relative is also undocumented, then there is that potential for another separation. And even if the children are placed in foster care, we know that sometimes that placement is not long term. So a lot of anxiety over future or additional potential separation. So a lot of clinginess that we're going to see. A lot of fears, a lot of worry for their loved ones because they don't know where they are, they don't know if they're safe, they don't know what is happening to them, but also a lot of fear and a lot of worry for themselves. A lot of concerns about what about me? What is going to happen to me? So, of course, you'll see a lot of excessive, not just the fear and the worry, but a lot of excessive crying, of course, the behavioral problems. And a lot of this might manifest itself through anger, through aggression, through fighting. Um, Also, the reluctance to bond with a new caregiver. And I mentioned this at the start of our call in regards to the adolescent girl that I was working with. This new family, they were so good to her. They were so concerned, and they were just doing everything that they could to ease the adjustment period and to make her feel like she was a member of the family. Um, the cousin, mom's cousin who took her in and her husband, they had three children, three biological children of their own. And so they made every effort to not differentiate between the kids and to treat her as they treated their own biological children. So they did everything right. And this girl really struggled with, I really like them and I really care about them and I'm happy with them and I want to be here, but this is wrong. Because what about my parents and what about my sister? That's my family. This is not my family. So just a lot of guilt over betraying the parents, betraying the quote unquote real family. And of course, with the fear, the worry, the anxiety, the crying, you're going to see the sadness. You're going to see the withdrawal. You're going to see some emotional numbing. You're going to see that detachment, and in some severe cases, you're also going to see maybe some self-injurious behavior, some risky behavior, some substance use, some running away, and all of these. Again, it's a short. Well, it doesn't look too short, but it's actually a very short list of some of the developmental impact that we can expect to see in traumatic grief and separation cases. I can see already that a couple of questions have been typed into the into the question box. It looks right now like there might have been an issue with somebody being able to hear, but I think that they are back. So just a reminder, if you do have a question about anything that I am talking about, please type it in to the question box. If there are questions that we are not able to get to, I will certainly answer them after the call via email. But for now, we will move on. And my slides are not forwarding. Give me 1 second. There we go. So when we're doing TF-CBT in traumatic grief cases, our goal, of course, is not to complete the grieving process during therapy, because again, there's no timetable for grief. some people are going to be able to move past it really quickly, and some people are just going to grieve for quite a bit. So we're not trying to get past, we're not trying to complete the grieving process. What we're trying to do rather is model for children that it is okay to feel sad when they experience a loss, and to give them the opportunity to express their grief in a setting where they can be vulnerable and they don't have to worry about others' vulnerability. And I mention that because I've seen so many different things in my own work. I have seen families where they do not speak about the deceased person because speaking about them just brings up all of this sadness. And so we just don't talk about them. There was one family that I worked with who lost a child, and they seem to have erased just any semblance of the child having existed. So they never spoke of the child. All of the child's things were removed from the home. Any picture that the child was in was removed. So it almost was as if that child never existed. So the surviving child that I was seeing really struggled with not being able to process his own grief because he couldn't talk about his sibling when he was at home. So this is what we are trying to do, is we're trying to provide that safe place for them to express that grief, and also to just give them the hope that their pain will diminish over time. Will it ever go away completely? Absolutely not. We're always going to hurt. We're always going to grieve over the person that we have lost, especially when it's a permanent loss. But the pain does ease. So what you see at the bottom of this slide is the grief focus component, and we're going to go into these in a little bit more detail now. So we'll start with the grief psychoeducation. And what this looks like for children is really providing some trauma-specific information related to the cause of death, and this is really important. Sometimes depending on how a death occurred, there is a reluctance to speak about the death itself, especially if it's something that has a stigma attached to it. So, for example, if the person who died overdosed, or they committed suicide, or they were a victim of gang-related violence, if they somehow, I don't want to sound victim blaming, but if they are perceived as having brought the death on themselves, then there is a stigma attached to that. And so parents will want to protect a child from the truth. And I understand that. I understand wanting to protect the children, but I always stress to the parents how important it is for children to know what happened, because inevitably the child will find out. They are going to, especially older kids, they're going to look something up. They're going to see something on social media, again, depending on the nature of the case, or there's going to be a well-meaning relative, or let's face it, we all have that kind of meddling, overbearing relative who likes to gossip. And so someone is going to come to the child and say, "Oh, you poor thing, I heard that your father committed suicide because he was going to go to jail." So it's so much better for the child to learn the truth, to learn the facts from the caregiver, and for the circumstances to be explained in a developmentally appropriate way, and for the child's questions to be answered. So a lot of times when I have parents who are reluctant to discuss the death with a child, I encourage them to have this conversation in a conjoint session. I am not going to be the one who is going to explain it to the child, but I will be there to intervene if necessary, to help the parent along, and of course to provide some, to provide whatever I can to the child if depending on how they react, if they become dysregulated. So we want to provide some very trauma-specific information about the cause of death. Of course, developmentally appropriate books about death, because this is a great way to model for children that it's okay to talk openly. Some of my favorites, if you're wondering about little ones, um, oh gosh, and the name just escaped me. I believe it's called When Mousie Died. That is a great book for little itty bitty ones. When Dinosaurs Die is another really good one. I really like, one of my favorite books, I think, is The Invisible String. That is a great, great book, not just for grief related to death, but just for grief related to any kind of any kind of separation. I really like using The Invisible String. You can, there are a few other tips here. Ask the child to draw a picture of what they think happens when somebody dies and correct any confusing ideas. It's really important also to be aware of the family's cultural and religious beliefs. And I bring this up again. I live along the border. I'm in a predominantly Hispanic Mexican American community, and I would say that a large majority of the families that I work with are Catholic. And so, depending on how devout their faith is, um, how much they really adhere to the teachings of the church, then I have worked with a lot of families who believe that suicide is a mortal sin. And if you commit suicide, you go to hell. So these are things that I need to know. I need to know what the family's religious beliefs are, what their cultural beliefs are, because this is something that I then have to work with. Just working with the children on being respectful of their cultural beliefs, their religious beliefs, but also addressing that fear and that worry that their loved one is now in hell. So we want to find out things like that. And the other thing about cultural and religious beliefs is that this may also impact whether or not we even talk about the person. Another thing that I often hear is that we don't speak of the dead because it doesn't allow their soul to rest. So how do you do grief work with somebody who can't talk about the person because they think that they're not allowing their soul to rest? So we really want to make sure that what we are doing is consistent or respectful of their cultural beliefs. And of course, we always want to encourage the child to talk about their grief and almost give them permission to grieve. In terms of psychoeducation, when working with parents, again, I mentioned this in the previous slide, addressing their beliefs about death and grief. Do they believe in heaven or hell? Do they believe in purgatory? What do they believe happens? What have they taught their children that happens after a death? And again, this might be related to the circumstances around the death. Again, whether it was while a crime was being committed, whether it was suicide, whether it was an accidental or intentional overdose. So we want to address those conflicts between what their culture, what their religion has taught them that is normal, and what they are actually experiencing, because it may not align. And also sometimes, especially if you're working with a very devout religious family, there may be questions of faith. There may be questions of how could God or whoever it is that they believe in, whoever it is that they worship, how could this higher being allow something like this to happen? Excuse me. So this is something that they may struggle with. Is just those questions, that test of their faith. And of course, we want to always, if you look at the third bullet, ascertain the parent's perception of the child's understanding of death. Sometimes younger ones do not quite grasp the permanence of death. Not too long ago, we had a referral for a young child, must have been about 4 years old, who had lost a loved one, who had lost a parent, but was looking forward to her birthday party because her dad was going to come to her birthday party. So she understood that he died, but she firmly believed that he would come back. He could come back for special occasions. Um, in the very beginning, I addressed the not wanting to tell the child how the loved one died. So we've already spoken about that, and also helping them to provide a developmentally appropriate. I shouldn't have said age appropriate, because it's not about chronological age. Um, it's it's about developmentally, where are they? So giving them a developmentally appropriate explanation of death. Um, and always just being aware of, and this is something that we need to be sensitive to, just that possibility that when we are addressing the child's grief, that's going to trigger the parent's grief. Because when you have a child who's grieving the loss of a sibling, then you have a parent who's grieving the loss of a child. If you have a child grieving the loss of a parent, you have a parent who's grieving the loss of a partner. So that also makes, I think, grief cases just a little bit more challenging to work with. And this is why sometimes when doing TF-CBT, we may not engage the caregiver in hearing a trauma narrative if they are still so overwhelmed with their own grief that they're not able to hear the narrative, and that they're not able to provide that support that the child needs. And of course, always emphasize there's no normal process for grieving the loss of a loved one, whether it be related to death or whether it be related to any type of separation. Grief is grief, and it takes as long as it's going to take. The other grief component was grieving the loss and also resolving ambivalent feelings about the deceased. And so for children, we want to look at a couple of things. One of the things that we want to look at is what I miss. So what is it that I am going to miss the most about the person that I have lost? And I realize that most of these slides are about actual death, but just as a reminder, this can apply to any type of separation. But what is it that they are going to miss the most? So things that they used to do together, but also identifying future events that they are now not going to get to experience together. So, if I am a young child, let's say that I'm an adolescent, I am already thinking, what, my prom is this weekend, and my mom is not going to be here to help me pick out a prom dress. One day I'm going to graduate in a month, and my dad is not going to be there to see me graduate. So starting to anticipate those events, and also addressing how the person that has been lost can be honored. I think that's something really important to consider. And something that I will share with all of you is something that I myself did, and this is something that you can do with your children. I had somebody that I was very, very, very close to. I was actually raised by my great grandmother, and I lost her shortly before I graduated from college, and I knew that that was a dream that she always had for me. Um, for me to get to graduate from college, I was the first one to do that, and so as my graduation drew nearer, it just, I was so excited and so looking forward to it, and at the same time just hurting because she would not be there. And because my Mama Susana, I was named after her, my Mama Susana was not going to be there to see me graduate. So what I did was I took a picture of the two of us, and I taped it to the inside of my graduation cap. So that was my way of taking her to graduation with me. So she was there, and she saw me graduate in my mind. So those little things, and that's not something that I will often share in a session, of course. Self-disclosure should always be kept to a minimum, but it's something that I'm willing to share in trainings and on calls and in webinars, because those are the kind of things that we want to help children anticipate, and just think about, Mother's Day just passed. How do we honor mom on Mother's Day if mother is no longer with us? How do we honor mom, in a couple of weeks at graduation if mom is no longer with us, or whoever that person is? So we want to anticipate those loss reminders and think of how we can still make that event special despite the absence of the person that we are separated from. Again, whether it be through death or any other separation. So addressing with children what they miss, but also making it okay to talk about what they don't miss. Because oftentimes it's very easy for us to think about the person that we're separated from, the person who has died, and, well, they were wonderful. They were perfect. There's never going to be anybody ever again like them. They never did anything wrong. And we want to make it okay to say, no, you know what? I'm glad that my sister is not getting into my clothes anymore. She always used to take my clothes and then she would ruin them. Things like that. But also sometimes there is an ambivalence. And I'll give you an example, and I know that I've shared this one during some of my trainings. A girl that I worked with, a young girl who was being physically abused by her father. Her younger brother was also being physically abused by their father. And there was also a lot of domestic violence. So when the father died, the child really struggled with missing him and grieving for him and being so sad because he died, but also being really happy. And she struggled with how can she be happy that he died? But through therapy, through TF-CBT, she came to learn that she was not happy that he died. She was sad that he died, but she was happy that she was safe and that her brother was safe and that her mom was safe. So she was happy that there was no more abuse, that there was no more violence. So those are the things that we want to address. I don't miss my dad beating my mom. I don't miss my dad hitting me. I don't miss my dad hitting my little brother. I don't miss that my brother used drugs. Those are good things. So we want to address what they don't miss and really address that unfinished business, things that they didn't get to say, or maybe their last words to the person were something harsh that they now regret and that they wish they could take back. So those are the things that we also want to address. And if you look at the last bullet, the child may have been closer to the deceased or the missing parent than the surviving one. So the ambivalent feelings might be toward the surviving parent or towards who they're with now, whether it be a foster parent or a relative that they are with now. So we definitely want to address that, and we want to do the same thing with the caregivers as well. So helping them to address this with the children, helping them to address what the child misses, what the child does not miss. This, of course, is likely to elicit feelings of sadness because, of course, the parent is also grieving their own loss, and we definitely want to normalize that. I'm going to tell you a game that I use a lot. It's a card game. It's called the Memory Garden. And that is something that I actually bought this deck of cards because it's all about grief and loss, and the child has to respond to what is written on the card, and the cards will say things like, "The person who died used to say," "The person who died taught me," "A scent that reminds me of the person who died is." But the reason that I bought this card deck was because of one card. And that one card said, "For the holidays." And I thought, wow, I can't imagine, as a young child having to experience that first Mother's Day without my mom, having to experience that first Christmas without my sibling, all of those firsts. So that's something that we also want to work on with parents is what are those future loss reminders and how are we going to honor the person and get through those grief reminders with the child. How are we going to help them through it? And of course, also with the parents, just like with the children, what I don't miss. Um, Very, very similar to what we are doing, exploring whether we're idealizing or devaluing the missing person, the deceased person. And this is, of course, where our CBT is going to come in, and validating what the child's views are, and helping the parent to help the child to resolve any unfinished business. And understanding that, the child saying, well, think about the example that I shared just a minute ago, that little girl who said, well, I'm glad my dad's dead. Understanding that that's okay. And the child just needs help to come to terms with what it is that she's happy about. Because this little girl that we were seeing, she was being told by her family how horrible she was, because what kind of a child is happy that her father died? Well, once she realized she was happy that she was safe, that really made a difference in how people responded to her. So we definitely want to address that with parents. So all of these things that we're doing with the children, we definitely want to be doing them with the parents as well. We want to help children to preserve positive memories of the deceased, or of the person that they are separated from. So give them permission to feel happy. And a lot of children do need that permission. And something that I do with a lot of my kids now is making a little memory scrapbook, or making a memory box. It can just be a little shoe box that is decorated, and we fill it with pictures, with keepsakes, with maybe maybe I remember that we saw this movie together, and I still have the ticket stub for the movie, so I put the ticket stub in my memory box. Maybe I'm a little boy, and my dad and I used to play baseball together, so I put, a baseball card, or I put a baseball in my memory box. Viewing videos, viewing those, I'm aging myself. I know they're not called home movies anymore, but, any kind of recordings of the deceased. And one of the ways that I do this in my own sessions is I let the children know that I never knew this person. So tell me about them. What were they like? And it's difficult sometimes for them to start having that conversation, but once they get started talking, it just becomes easier. And so I just ask a lot of questions. It's like, all right, so tell me what their favorite color was. So tell me something that they always used to say. So tell me what kind of movies they liked. And that's just for them to see that, yes, I'm hurting over the person, but I have so many great memories that I can draw from. And that does bring some bit of comfort. So we want to give them permission to recall those happy memories, and to look back on them, and just feel happy. Again, that permission to feel happy. A lot of children, for different reasons, did not attend a memorial service, did not attend a funeral. So I've had a few families where we've had to coordinate something like this, where a small memorial service is held, and the child prepares a eulogy. And this can mean maybe the child visiting the graveside. The grave site for the first time. So this is something that, definitely we're going to coordinate with the parents. And I have had children, again, prepare eulogies and then go to the cemetery and share this. And of course, for parents, definitely encouraging them to assist the child in preserving those positive memories. And this goes back to, sometimes we don't speak about the deceased, making that okay. Because a lot of children will tell you, if I talk about, if I talk about my dad, if I talk about my grandma, if I talk about my brother, my mom cries. Making that okay. Again, normalizing those reactions, but encouraging the parents also to be the ones to start that conversation. So for example, the weekend is coming up, and there's a new movie that's going to be released, and just saying, oh my God, that's exactly the kind of movie that so and so would have enjoyed seeing. We should go watch that movie. So that makes it okay for the child to say, oh yeah, I remember that time that we saw this movie. Or, oh, well, yeah, but can we have a hot dog? Because remember, she used to always like having hot dogs at the movies. All right, so we really want to start that conversation and really encourage the parents to do that. And also, this is going to show the child that the parent can tolerate having this discussion. And it gets to a point where we can talk about the person, and yeah, we're sad, but we can also smile. We can also laugh. Just a couple more slides that I want to get to. The other thing that we want to do is help to redefine the relationship with the deceased and commit to present and future relationships. We don't want children to isolate themselves and to not have healthy interactions with other people for fear of being disloyal, but also for fear of another loss. That fear of, if I get too close to someone, they're just going to die anyway. If I get too close to someone, they're just going to leave anyway, because everybody leaves. Everyone gets taken away from me. So we want to, again, give them permission not only to be happy, but also give them permission to maintain, but also to develop new relationships with other people. And we want to do this, of course, with the parents as well. And the children may need their parents' permission. It's not just our permission as therapists, but the parents' permission to let go of the relationship that they had with the missing person as an interactive one. And just also explain that ability to focus on present relationships and maintaining those and developing new ones, that's part of resolving the grief. That's also a part of healthy development. So we want to really emphasize how important it is to develop those interactions with the adults that are going to be anchors for the child so that they don't become stuck in the past. I realize that this isn't necessarily a grief example, but it's just something that actually happened last night. So a couple of weeks ago, and I'm talking about being stuck in the past. A couple of weeks ago, my fiance was in a pretty bad car accident, and my goodness, if I see his vehicle, it's just incredible to me that he even walked away from it, and I'm just so grateful that he walked away without a scratch. His truck, of course, was totaled, and so we're dealing with insurance and everything. And last night we went out to look at vehicles because he needs to replace his vehicle. He needs a new vehicle, and every vehicle that he saw, every new truck that he saw was like, well, that's nice, but my old truck. And I finally told him, okay, let me go into therapist mode here. Sweetheart, your truck is totaled. I know you're grieving for your truck, but it is okay to like a new one. And I certainly don't want to sound like I'm minimizing what we're talking about here, but I just thought, that's an example of just being stuck in the past, and I can't possibly drive a new vehicle. What about what about mine? And that's how children can feel. Also, it's, how can I have fun because this person can't have fun anymore? How can I get along with mom's new boyfriend? My dad's dead. So we don't want them to be stuck. And just the last point that I want to make is that as we're not only closing our webinar, but also closing treatment, we want to predict for children that they are going to be sad. They are going to grieve. They are going to experience trauma reminders. They are going to experience loss reminders, and this is okay. And give them permission to grieve when that happens. Plan for what they're going to do. How are they going to cope? how are they going to draw support from their parent or whoever their caregiver is, from their support system? Um, are they going to practice their relaxation techniques? Are they going to visit the memorial site? Are they going to engage in an activity that honors the deceased person? And just give them permission to have those feelings, but also realize that for children, especially in grief cases, ending treatment can also bring on some grief for them, because this is another goodbye, and they may have become so attached to us that it's almost like they're experiencing a whole other loss. So we definitely want to be respectful and be mindful of that. And that, again, brought us right to our time. My contact information, I'm going to leave it up there for a second for anybody who may want to just make a note of it. And also, of course, you have it in your handouts. And I will just go back to Keely, our moderator. Any final comments that you might have?
The only thing would be just to remind everybody that you will be getting an email with the slides and the recording of the webinar. So everyone will be getting that. As long as you entered a valid email address when you registered, you'll be getting an email later this afternoon with all of that. So be on the lookout for that.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning, and I hope you will join us again in June when we will talk about TF-CBT and behavioral problems. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you, Dr. Rivera.